The Origin of the Five Races, or How J.F. Blumenbach Got Hijacked, a Historical Perspective. My name is John S. Michael. I'm an independent scholar, and I am going to talk today about Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a man who is often known as the father of physical anthropology or the father of anthropology, depending on who you talk to. And he is the man who is often credited for popularizing the notion that there are five races of humanity. And many of his ideas, which were started during his lifetime, he lived around the time of the American Revolution. A lot of his ideas about race are still with us today. When we talk about race, we talk about what we call typologies in the study of race. Typology is basically any any way to categorize anything. Just making categories or making types is called typology. In Brazil, when they talk about the types of human beings, they have a number of different ways of describing people, but one of the more common ones is to talk about people as being curly-haired black, straight-haired black, mulatto, dark-haired white, or fair-haired white. So that would be the way to describe people who have either African or European ancestry or a little bit of both. And there's actually in Brazil, there's many more ways to describe people. Now in the United States, we have a tendency to just talk about five categories for all types of people everywhere in the world. And this is from a study that was done in 2007, and they describe Americans as black, or Hawaiian Pacific Islander, or Asian, or Native American, or white. So that would be five categories with five different terms. Is it any better or any worse than the way they describe them in Brazil? No. They're both equally as accurate or equally as inaccurate. In the 2010 the 2010 census, they refer to statistical races. And these are the five races we just discussed, and they can be traced back to our friend Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. He lived a very long life, 1752 to 1840. He was celebrated as an anatomist and a museum curator during his lifetime. He lived at and did his research at the University of Göttingen in Germany, mostly between 1776 and 1795. So this is really the period of the Revolutionary War. And then he actually lived into to 1840, which was the decades before the Civil War. So he had a long career, very influential, not well known today, but in his time, he was very influential. He wrote a best-selling anatomy book, and as you can see, this version here is in English. His works were translated into many languages. He was a museum curator for 50 years, which is a long time. Back then, still is. And museums back in those days were not simply places that you went for entertainment. If you were teaching a class in anatomy or zoology, you didn't have a PowerPoint show. What you would do is you'd take a stuffed animal like that Arctic fox there, and you'd pass it around the classroom. So that's what museums were about. He first described the platypus. A lot of people didn't believe that the platypus actually existed, and he somehow got a specimen, probably pickled, that was sent from Australia to Germany, and he described it. He was very famous, and this is a diagram that comes from Google Books, and it shows the number of times that in books that they have scanned that a Blumenbach's name is mentioned. And you can see around 1830, 1840, he's mentioned a lot. But people stopped reading his books and becoming interested after evolution became the standard accepted form of biological theory. Um, his ideas were not based on evolution, and so he kind of faded into obscurity. He was an environmentalist monogenist. Now, the term environmentalist, as it was used back then, was someone who described who said that the environment shaped life forms. So it was not you were not you didn't inherit all of your traits. The environment shaped your traits. So that made him an environmentalist. He did not accept that heredity shaped life forms. The opposite of an environmentalist was a hereditarian. So it's a slightly different meaning than we have today. He was also a monogenist. And so in 1776, he argued that all humans shared one origin. This was actually common in Europe for a long time because it was the story that came out of the Bible. According to the Bible, Adam and Eve were the first two humans, and they gave rise to the sons of Noah. And that was the sons of Noah then who populated the earth and had different types, different forms. This gentleman in the red down in the corner was Lord Keynes, and in 1774 he argued that different human groups had different origins, and that's also known as many Adams. So he was saying, no, the people from Asia and West Africa and Northern Europe and North and South America, they didn't all come from one source. They had different origins, and that's what polygenist means. Poly means many, gen means kind, many kinds. So that gives you a little context to what Blumenbach was doing. He was arguing for the unity of all human types. Other peoples were saying just the opposite. Blumenbach also had a library, which was unique. It was the first collection of African and African American literature. Blumenbach, he ran a museum, so he collected a lot of things. Many of the things that he collected were provided to him from British sailors because the university he worked for was founded by the German-born King of England. So he also collected books. And as you'll see, a lot of these books are in English. Among his collection was Benjamin Banneker, who was a New World Black. He was from Maryland. That's where he was born. He actually was famous for writing almanacs, farmers' almanacs. There's lots of sort of myths and legends about him which aren't true, but his claim to fame was he wrote almanacs. Oh, there my parakeet is chirping in the background. There was also Reverend J.E.J. Captain. He was born in Ghana, the first West African to graduate from a Dutch university. Ignatius Sancho was an actor and an author in Britain. I think he was the first Black Briton to vote in an election. He was born in Africa. Phyllis Wheatley, born in Africa, came to Massachusetts as a child, was a slave, but learned to read and write and became a well-known poet. I think she spoke Greek and maybe another language in addition to English, and I don't know whether she retained her original African language. And then Oluwadu Aquilano, who was born, everyone thinks he was born in Africa, may have been born in America to African parents. He was a slave in North America, got free, ended up sailing on ships, and was a very successful author. Now, these books were used by one of Blumenbach's colleagues, a man named Father Henry Gregory. That's what they call him in English. And he wrote a book called The Literature of Negroes. And he argued that West Africans had the same intellectual capacity as Northern Europeans. He's been called not only anti-racist, but pro-Negro. And you have to remember that back in those days, the word Negro was a polite form. So if you were showing respect for somebody from West Africa, you would refer to them as a Negro. You might even use that instead of calling them Mister, which is not fair, but that's the way it was back then. So Blumenbach was an associate of this guy and Blumenbach lent some of his books to Father Gregory. People who knew Blumenbach included Johann Gruber, a German who said Blumenbach defended the unity of mankind when slave traders needed to be wakened from their slumber. Karl Marx, not that Karl Marx, but Karl F.H. Marx. He was a professor at Göttingen, and also, like the famous Karl Marx, he was a Jewish intellectual in Germany, and he was Blumenbach's friend and physician. He said, when Negroes and savages were regarded as half animals, and when the idea of emancipation of slaves had not begun to excite interest, Blumenbach raised his voice to show that their qualities were not inferior to those of Europeans. In France, Jean-Pierre Florin said, for Blumenbach, all men are born or might have been born from the same man. He calls the Negroes our black brothers. In Germany again, Friedrich Tiedemann said, my venerable friend Blumenbach and Bishop Gregory, who we mentioned before, were defenders of the intellectual powers of Negroes. So here we have testimony from 4 people who knew him, who said that Blumenbach was what you would call pro-Negro. He was an egalitarian who argued that West Africans had the same intellectual capacity as Northern Europeans. Blumenbach's most famous anthropological book was called De Generis Humani, the 3rd edition of which was published in 1795. And in it, he said, Generis Humani varietates quinei principes species vero unica, the 5 principal varieties of humankind but one species. And I've highlighted the word 5 principal varieties. That was how he described in this work and in his Latin texts the types of humanity. He didn't call them race. Of course, in Latin, there really isn't a word for race. But he used the term principal varieties. And I'm going to return to that again and again. This was his drawing, this famous illustration. If you Google Blumenbach, you will find this, and it's 5 skulls of his 5 principal varieties. And so he named them Mongolian, which would be East Asian people and Central Asian peoples. Americans, that'd be North and South Americans. Caucasians, people from Europe, India, and the Mediterranean. Malay, that's kind of a misnomer, but that was how he described people from Oceania and Australia. That would be Australians, Polynesians, Melanesians, anybody from the Pacific area. And Ethiopian, that would be non-Mediterranean Africans. That's also, in the common terminology called Sub-Saharan African or Black African, or the more archaic term, Negro. He said that all 5 of these principal varieties were linked. They were not distinct and separate, which a lot of people said that they were. A lot of people still think they are, but that's not what he said. He said, are men more than one species? ? Although there seems to be so great a difference between widely separated nations, one variety of mankind does so sensibly pass into the other that you cannot mark out the limits between them. This is a clunky English translation of his Latin, which was very long-winded. But what he's saying is, although there seems to be great differences between people from far away, there's actually not that big a difference. There are connections between them. You really can't draw a line and separate one group of people into a different type from another. What he was proposing was a racial spectrum, like the color spectrum. Yellow trends into orange, into red, into purple, into blue. They're all connected. There really is no distinct, separate entities. Zoologists now refer to a gradually changing population as a cline. Essentially, that's what Blumenbach was talking about. However, he also said there were transitional varieties, that between these primary varieties, there were transitional ones. He said, specimina ab insignum transitum memorabilia quo diversus generis humanus varietatis quasi invincim jungunt. He says in this text that he has specimens that designate transitory, notable, transitional forms between the diverse humankind's varieties. And here's some evidence of that. He wrote a book about mummies in 1794. It was one of the few things he published in English. I think he had someone help him translate it. And he said, I think the Egyptians will find their place between the Caucasian and the Ethiopian. So he was saying Egyptians are neither Caucasian Europeans nor Ethiopians, Southern Africans. But they differ more than that. There's a unique transitory form. He also said, let's see, he said that people from Papua New Guinea and New Hollanders, who are native Australian people, he said that they are graduate. They're slightly in between the Ethiopian variety and people of the Pacific. He said that he thought that the Kyrgyz who are from Central Asia were transitory between what he called the Mongolians and the Europeans. The same with Tibetans. He said he thought Eskimos were halfway between Native Americans and Asians, and that Philippine Islanders were also a transitory group. So I'll show you a diagram. This is the diagram that shows his racial varieties, his primary racial varieties, the big five: Caucasian, Mongolian, American, Ethiopian, and Malay. But he thought that they were all linked. The most obvious, I think, for us today would be that the Eskimo, what he called Eskimos, Canada, they call Inuit, that they are a transitional group between North Americans, Native Americans, and Mongolians, which would be Far Eastern people. He thought that the Cossacks, the Kyrgyz, and the Tibetans were, again, transitional groups linking Caucasians and Mongolians, which would be Europeans and East Asian peoples. He thought that Egyptians, as we mentioned, were a link between Ethiopians and Caucasians, and he also thought the Roma, who were commonly called Gypsies, were also a link between Europeans and Sub-Saharan Africans. We now know that the Roma are actually originated in India and are sort of a ethnically mixed people now. But he thought that they were this transition. He thought Filipinos were a transition between people from Asia, the continent of Asia, and what he called Malay, which would be people from the South Pacific and Australia. And then he sort of proposed that the people from Papua New Guinea and Australia were a link between Sub-Saharan African people and people of the Pacific Islands. Interesting ideas. Whether they're right or wrong, they are what they show is his worldview. That he did not believe that there were separate and distinct races. He thought that there were larger groups and smaller groups which linked them. So, for him, humans were one entity with many parts. Does this exist in nature where you have one entity with many parts? Well, he was an anatomist. And so when we look at, say, the digestive system, we see there's the stomach, the large intestines, the small intestines, the bowel. There are many parts to this naturally occurring phenomenon, and they have names. And they're suitably different. You would never confuse the large intestines with the stomach, but yet they're all part of one entity. Also, the world's oceans. We all know about the oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, Indian Ocean, but we're actually kind of wrong because there's only one ocean. It has parts. You can tell if you're off the coast of South Carolina or Spain, you're in the Atlantic. If you're off the coast of California or Peru, you're in the Pacific. But that's just a part of the one ocean. It's like, you can tell the difference between your thumb and your big toe, but they're part of one entity. The transitional varieties that Blumenbach wrote about were overlooked by a lot of his contemporaries and certainly after he died. One of his students was the famous poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote, what did he write? He wrote the poem that goes, Kubla Khan in Xanadu a stately pleasure dome decree, something along those lines. And he was a leading intellectual of his era. He was also a student of Blumenbach's, and he said Blumenbach makes 5 races, Kant 3. Blumenbach's scale of dignity may thus be figured, and he do this diagram of a triangle with the Caucasian or European at the top, Malay and American next, and at the bottom, Negro and Mongolian Asiatic. That's not true. Blumenbach never proposed that. We saw the diagram earlier where he didn't make a triangle diagram like that. And so this was a misinterpretation. And of course, nowhere do we see Egyptians, Eskimos, Filipinos. Some other of his people who wrote about Blumenbach, mostly after Blumenbach died. This fellow A. Barrington wrote, of Blumenbach's 5 races, the Caucasian ranks first and is superior to the others in intelligence, courage, invention, enterprise, and high moral attainments. Blumenbach never said that. Hubert Howe Bancroft in 1886 said, Blumenbach's divisions are Caucasian or Aryan, Mongolian, Ethiopian, Malay, and American. Blumenbach did not use the term Aryan. He said Caucasian. Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire in 1865, who was actually much more influential than these other 2 guys who I don't really know what else they did other than write that. But St. Hilaire was an influential, I think, anatomist, and certainly wrote about human racial variation. He said, if all the 5 races of Blumenbach must be considered as natural groups, is it proper to place them at the same rank? Blumenbach himself did not think this. Not true. Blumenbach did say they were at the same rank. As earlier we showed, people who knew him talked about how he was an egalitarian. There have also been modern charges that Blumenbach was pro-Caucasian, if you will, biased towards Caucasian and biased towards Caucasians' beauty. In 1993, Scheibinger said, for Blumenbach, the Caucasians' great beauty simply revealed them as the original humans from which all other races degenerated. Dane in 2002 said Blumenbach's choice of whites as the first humans was evidence of Blumenbach's patent ethnocentrism. Collins said Blumenbach's most destructive theories arranged Caucasians at the top. Kivak said Blumenbach's research was a hierarchical arrangement favoring the Caucasian ideal. And Sussman said the very concept of the Caucasian race was based on purely aesthetic grounds derived from Blumenbach's own set of aesthetics. These are very different views of Blumenbach than were presented by the people who knew him. who praised him for being an egalitarian and saying that Europeans and West Africans were equal. What's going on? Why is there this difference? Well, let's look at to see if these charges, the modern charges, are even fair. In 1996, Gould wrote that Blumenbach decided to rank people by physical beauty alone and established a racial model that placed a single race at the pinnacle. And here's this diagram. It's the skull diagram, but it's a triangle with the Caucasians at the top. That's not the way Blumenbach presented it. In 1988, Juncker actually, he's German, showed that Gould's diagram was miscopied and that the actual diagram has no single race at the top. That's what the diagram actually looks like. Cook, in 2006, called Gould's critique an inappropriately quantitative reading of Blumenbach's work from a popular magazine, which meant it was not peer-reviewed. So these people are saying, no, these charges, modern charges, aren't fair. Now, the key to this, why there's two different views, is because Degeneres Humani, the big, important book that Blumenbach wrote, it took 70 years until it was translated into English. It was translated into German in 1798, which is interesting because Blumenbach wrote it in Latin, even though he spoke German, and then somebody else translated it into German. It was translated from Latin into French in 1806. It was only in 1865, many years after Blumenbach died, that the Latin version was translated into English, and that English version is what modern scholars often read. What was going on during 1865? The American Civil War. So, and I'll go back to this again, the English translation of the Latin book was done during the Civil War, which was a war fought over whether slavery would be legal in the United States, and the underlying principle was it all right to enslave some races and not enslave others? It was the basic argument. And that was when this English translation came out. Who published the 1865 translation? Well, we know the translator, the editor, was Thomas Bendische, a man about whom little is known. I've done research and I can't find much about him. He wrote the first history of anthropology. He belonged to a group called the Cannibal Club, which was a bunch of wealthy men from London who dined together. It was a dining club, and they would dine with a mace of a Negro gnawing a bone. So a mace, it's a big wooden sort of pole, and when people got too loud and raucous, they'd bang it on the floor. One of the people who knew him said he was the most virulent person I remember to have heard of. He was a vice president of the Anthropological Society of London. The Anthropological Society of London was an organization of scholars and just people who were interested in racial variation, and they studied anthropology from a specifically race supremacist perspective. They believed that Northern Europeans were a superior race and that was a fundamental truth, and that was something that you needed to have as a core when you studied anthropology. Their members included American representatives of the Confederacy. So there were people who were the Confederate States of America was what the South was called during the Civil War. They had representatives who were members of this organization. The Cannibal Club was made of this dining club were people from the Anthropological Society of London, and they also were fond of producing racial subjugation-based pornography. So this was kind of a bunch of rich guys who got together for wild parties and did some pretty crazy stuff. This organization was founded by James Hunt. He was a speech pathologist. He was a very successful speech pathologist, and he made a lot of money. And he was also interested in race. So he was not trained as an anatomist or a zoologist like Blumenbach or some other folks, but he had a lot of money, and he wanted to form this organization. And he wrote a book called The Negro's Place in Nature. He stated that the Negro is inferior intellectually to the European, and he wrote that there is a good reason for classifying the Negro as a distinct species from the European. Pretty clearly stating his views, that he was a race supremacist. Now, you can't see it very clearly, but that circle there is around, says price 15 cents. This book he wrote, he wasn't writing it for just to go into academic journals and libraries. He was trying to influence public policy. This is a book he was trying to sell. Now, there are errors in the 1865 translation, and they have been documented by Michael, who is me. And the 1865 translation includes numerous translation errors, which form a pattern indicating that Bendishi employed two translators. The second translator was also used terms that denigrated extra-Europeans while adulating Europeans. So this was my fancy pants journal language, which I used to describe how it was just a bad translation. And a lot of the terms are translated in such a way that it makes Europeans look good and beautiful, and it makes non-Europeans look stupid and ugly. And that was not the actual words in Latin. That was not a good translation. Douglas in 2008 noted that the 1865 translation, the English word race, had persistently infiltrated the translation. She noted that the word varietas and gens are sometimes race. Adjective inflections of gens are usually racial. So whenever a word in Latin described a type, Bendishi changed the word to race. Demel, who's German and writes mostly in German, describes the 1865 translation as problematic and still frequently used. So the translation is bad, the 1865 translation in English, and it makes Blumenbach appear to be quite the racist, when in fact he wasn't. So we started off by talking about typology and Blumenbach's views about the different varieties of humanity. Was he right all along? Now, in recent decades, there has been a rejection of the notion that races are distinct biological realities. This is a diagram from Houghton, who in 1931, very prominent, influential anthropologist, and you can see he's got, at the bottom of this diagram, he's got human beings as sort of branching off into separate, distinct races, but then he has them all mixing together in a more modern, the last, many thousand years. So he shows them as being distinct, but then kind of mishmashing and merging together. The man who really was successful in sort of knocking down the notion that races are distinct and a biological reality was Ashley Montagu in 1964. His book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. He did a very good job of showing how so many of the arguments to say that races were distinct and it was biologically valid, he really proved that those arguments were bad and very unscientific and pretty arbitrary, and that was generally accepted. He didn't come up with an alternative to explain why people do look different in different locations. I like Ruth Benedict's view of race. She actually came up with a lot of the ideas that Montague used, and I don't think she got full credit, probably because she was a woman scholar, and I think she deserves more credit, and Montague just was very good at publicizing himself, which she was not. In 1940, she wrote, "Racism, the ism of the modern world. For the individual, therefore, racism means that damnation or salvation in this world is determined at conception. An individual's good life cannot tip the balance in his favor, and he cannot live a bad life if his physical type is the right sort. By virtue of birth alone, each member of the race is high caste and rightly claims his place in the sum at the expense of men of other races. He need not base his pride upon personal achievement nor upon virtue. He was born high caste. And that I agree with. I believe what we're talking about in the United States when we say race is actually caste. We have a caste system here. Just like they have in India, just like they had in ancient Rome, many places, that's what we've really got. People who are born to certain ancestral lines, which limits what kind of jobs they have when they grow up. Caste is, it's from the 16th century Portuguese and Spanish words casta raça, meaning pure lineage, race, or breed. So caste and race, actually, look at the origins of the words, they mean the same thing. So, human biodiversity, that's really what we're talking about when we say race. We're talking about, yeah, there's diversity in human forms. It's biodiversity. There's biodiversity. All animals have got different forms. Now, Ernst Haeckel, he was a German Darwinist, big fan of Darwin, and he was the guy who really developed, he didn't really invent them, but he really developed and promoted the notion of evolutionary trees. And here we see an evolutionary tree that he did of human beings, of races. He was treating races as if they were different types of species that evolved separately. And at the top, Berbers, Jews, Romans, and Germans. Below that, there's, let's see, Slavs. Off to the and then and at the off to the side, we have Native Americans, Patagonians, Japanese, Mongolians. So that was his view. Then there was a guy in the 1940s, Franz Weidenreich, who was a very inventive thinker. And he said, no, there aren't separate groups. It's like a network where, yeah, there's the Australian group, the Mongolian, African, and the Eurasian group, but they're all connected. There's this mishmash, this network. And he had proposed that even Neanderthals were related to modern humans, and this is a skull of a Neanderthal, like person who has Neanderthal traits and the human traits, most notably the chin, which Neanderthals didn't have. And so Weidenreich, he was kind of proposing a similar thing to Blumenbach. And nowadays, there are people who really support Franz Weidenreich's view. Alan Templeton talks about a trellis rather than a tree. And that's very similar to what Blumenbach was talking about. One variety of mankind does so sensibly pass into the other, you cannot mark out the limits between them. There's a network. They're all connected. So, does this make sense from a zoological perspective? Human beings are an animal? Is what Blumenbach talking about? Does it make sense when we look at other animals? Well, orangutans, there are two species of orangutans, Javan and Sumatran. They just found that out just recently due to DNA, but they look almost exactly the same. I can't tell them apart. However, gorillas, who are now known to be but one species, have two subspecies, the western mountain gorilla. You can tell them apart. In one of them, the males have kind of reddish hair on their head and short hair on their face. The other one, they have black hair and longer hair on their face. In a way, that's one of the differences between human beings. Some have reddish hair, some of them have the males have very hairy faces, others they don't. There really is, each species has kind of its own diversity. You really can't, there's a lot of variety. And then there's things like the eastern red wolf, which was thought to be a wolf, a small reddish wolf, but now is known to be a coy wolf hybrid. When Europeans and Africans started landing in North America, they started farming, the ecology changed, and it appears that at some point, wolves and coyotes in the American South started to breed together. There's another interesting way to look at species, which Ernst Mayr in 1931 discovered, the notion of sister species. This is the Lara skull. You see them in Scotland and Northern Europe. I went to Scotland and I saw one. That's how I know. And the way it works is like population 1 here in Scandinavia, they can breed with Scottish or with Russian gulls, but they cannot breed with gulls from Canada or Alaska. So it's kind of, you can breed with the population next to you, but not the ones farther away. And yet they're all one species. Dobzhansky, who was Russian-born American scholar, when he was a younger man, he studied ladybugs from Russia, all across Russia and into China. And what he found was that there are varieties in the color patterns in the back of these ladybugs. And he called them a polytypic species. Poly, many, types. Yeah, it was one species, but they varied from place to place, and they covered a large area. They went from Europe all the way to China. You are here. And this is my opinion, and Dobzhansky also thought that this was the case. So I'm quoting him. He said, human beings are a polytypic species. And this seems to make sense. So we can say Blumenbach was sort of right. His primary varieties are consistent with the notion of a polytypic species. This was the diagram that he showed of types that all blended into each other. This was what Dobzhansky showed, types that all blended into each other. Dobzhansky was saying there's one species of ladybug. Blumenbach was saying there's one species, one type of human being. So, this finding that Blumenbach supported a racial spectrum, will it end racism? No. But at least Blumenbach has given us some good examples to follow. And not Blumenbach alone. Oluwadu Akwiano, I mentioned him earlier on. Blumenbach was interested in his life story, so he wrote him letters. Blumenbach and Oluwadu were colleagues. And one day, when Blumenbach visited Britain, he went and he met with Oluwadu, and they talked together. And I would like to be a fly on that wall. Because Oluwadu, not only had he been to Africa, North America as a slave, but he also went through Canada. So he probably met a lot of various native peoples, perhaps polar peoples. And in this world where they lived in, where West Africans were not supposed to be literate people, many people thought they weren't even capable of it, and where European scholars, in many instances, and many of Blumenbach's fellow professors, thought that you would not lower yourself to having a discussion with a West African. Blumenbach said, no, I'm going to do it. And he spoke with Akwiano. And Akwiano, who had every reason in the world not to want to deal with the leaders of the society which enslaved him, he met. They met and they talked. So one of the things about talking about race is there's so many bad things that happened as a result of it, of racism throughout our history. And you study it and you get depressed. But sometimes if you study it, you find examples that make you say, no, there's a way forward for us. We don't have to be like we were in the past.